This video focuses on a specific strain of science fiction, not stories about distant galaxies or advanced machines, but films that examine what happens when human beings themselves become part of a system. These are stories where people are tested, programmed, conditioned, monitored, or repurposed in the name of progress, security, or control. The films in this list share a common idea. They treat the individual not as an end, but as a component, a variable to be adjusted, a resource to be managed. In these worlds, human value is defined by usefulness, stability, or compliance. Identity becomes flexible. Consent becomes temporary. Freedom is tolerated only as long as it does not disrupt the system. This list is not about body horror or spectacle. The focus is not mutation monsters or shock. Instead, it is about quiet forms of dehumanization, administrative control, psychological conditioning, institutional logic that justifies experimentation without ever needing to call it that. Most of these films were released decades ago, yet they reflect anxieties that feel increasingly familiar. Governments seeking perfect control. Corporations optimizing behavior, scientific ambition, overriding ethical limits. In each case, the system does not present itself as evil. It presents itself as necessary. The selection here follows a clear framework. Each film explores a scenario where people are reduced to functions within a larger structure. Whether through identity replacement surveillance, behavioral programming, or forced adaptation, the human being is no longer the central concern. Efficiency is. This countdown does not rank these films by popularity or technical achievement. It organizes them by how clearly they express this idea. People turned into systems. Some approach it through science, others through politics, technology, or social design. All of them raise the same underlying question. At what point does improvement become ownership? And when systems grow more complex than the people inside them, who is really in control? These films do not offer solutions. They document a process. And that process begins long before the future arrives. 1. Seconds. Seconds presents one of the earliest and most restrained visions of human experimentation in science fiction. The film appears to offer reinvention, but its real subject is control. It explores a system that promises personal freedom while quietly eliminating it. The story follows a man who is recruited by a secret organization offering a complete transformation. His body is altered, his identity erased, and his past officially closed. In exchange, he receives a new life under a different name. The process is presented as voluntary, legal, and carefully managed. What matters is not the transformation itself, but what follows. The new identity comes with expectations. Behavior is monitored. Choices are guided. Social interactions are subtly directed. The subject is free only within a predefined framework. Individual desire becomes a variable that must be corrected when it interferes with stability. The core idea of Seconds is that systems do not need force to control people. They need structure. Once identity is treated as something transferable, the individual becomes replaceable. Failure is not corrected through support, but through removal. The organization does not react emotionally to non-compliance. It simply categorizes outcomes. Those who do not adapt are processed again, not out of punishment, but efficiency. The system does not exist to restore lives. It exists to maintain function. Seconds frames human experimentation as an administrative process rather than a scientific one. Identity is managed like property. Consent becomes irrelevant once participation begins. The film remains relevant because its warning is quiet. Control does not arrive as oppression. It arrives as opportunity. And once accepted, there is no clear way back. 2. The Quester tapes. The Quester tapes approaches human experimentation through design rather than coercion. Quester is created to appear human, think logically, and operate independently. Yet from the beginning, his existence is defined by limits placed deliberately into his construction. The story follows Quester as he works alongside human scientists while slowly realizing that his identity is incomplete. His intelligence is advanced, but his lifespan is restricted. His curiosity is allowed, but only within boundaries. The system that created him does not view these limits as cruelty. They are safeguards. What matters in this film is how humanity is treated as a specification. Emotions are approximated. Ethics are programmed. Purpose is assigned. Quester's search for his creator is not framed as a right, but as a malfunction. Knowledge becomes something that must be regulated. As Quester gets closer to the truth, the system responds predictably. It does not negotiate. It prepares to shut him down. His growing awareness is not seen as progress, but inefficiency. The film presents experimentation as a managerial process. Once a subject exceeds intended use, termination becomes a logical outcome. The Quester tape suggests a future where being human is not a natural state, but a controlled condition that can be revoked when it no longer serves its purpose. 3. Telephone. In Telephone, human experimentation operates through psychological programming rather than physical modification. Ordinary people live normal lives unaware that they have been conditioned decades earlier to respond to specific verbal triggers. The film reveals that these individuals were programmed as sleeper agents designed to carry out sabotage when activated. Once the trigger phrase is spoken, free will disappears. Memory hesitation and moral judgment are bypassed instantly. What makes this system effective is its invisibility. The subjects are not monitored daily. They are released back into society. The experiment remains dormant until the system requires activation. In this sense, the experiment never ends. It simply waits. The system does not consider long-term consequences. Human lives are treated as expendable contingencies. When activation occurs, the subjects are eliminated immediately after use. Responsibility is diffused across institutions, leaving no single authority accountable. Telephone presents a model of control built on forgetting. The subjects believe they are free because they are unaware of what was done to them. The film suggests that the most efficient systems are those that do not need constant enforcement. They only need access. 4. Capricorn 1. Capricorn 1 explores human experimentation through deception rather than technology. When a Mars mission fails, before launch, the system chooses to preserve the appearance of success by rewriting reality itself. The astronauts are removed from public view and placed into isolation. They are instructed to continue performing their roles as if the mission were real. Their consent is assumed rather than granted. Once selected, their lives belong to the narrative being constructed around them. The system treats truth as optional and stability as essential. The astronauts are no longer individuals with agency. They are components sustaining public confidence. Survival becomes secondary to credibility. As the deception expands, the system demonstrates its priorities. Maintaining the illusion matters more than human life. When the astronauts attempt to escape, they are treated as liabilities rather than victims. Capricorn 1 frames experimentation as narrative control. The subjects are not altered physically, but their existence is rewritten to serve institutional needs. The film suggests that systems do not always experiment on bodies. Sometimes they experiment on reality itself. 5. The Boys from Brazil. The Boys from Brazil examines human experimentation through replication rather than modification. The system at the center of the film does not attempt to improve individuals. It attempts to reproduce a specific outcome by recreating a life repeatedly under controlled conditions. The story revolves around a cloning project designed to duplicate a historical figure. But cloning is only the first step. The experiment extends into upbringing, environment, and emotional pressure. Each subject is placed into a carefully constructed childhood meant to mirror a predetermined path. What defines this experiment is its scale and patience. It is not designed to produce immediate results. It unfolds over decades. Individual lives are observed not for who the subjects become, but for how closely they align with expectation. Personal deviation is treated as statistical noise. The system behind the project believes identity can be engineered through structure. Genetics provide the foundation. Circumstances provide the trigger. Free will is acknowledged only as a variable that must be minimized. As the experiment progresses, its flaw becomes clear. Despite identical designs, outcomes differ. The subjects develop independently, shaped by unpredictable human experience rather than controlled inputs. The system fails not because of resistance, but because it misunderstands the nature of individuality. The Boys from Brazil presents human experimentation as a form of ideological control. People are not valued as individuals, but as iterations of a concept. The film suggests that systems built to recreate humanity often fail because they treat people as repeatable designs rather than autonomous lives. The experiment does not collapse through rebellion. It collapses through inconsistency. And that inconsistency is human. 6. Altered states. Altered states presents human experimentation as a pursuit driven by scientific curiosity rather than institutional control. The experiment targets consciousness itself, operating on the assumption that identity is not fixed, but layered, reversible, and chemically accessible. The story follows a researcher who subjects himself to sensory deprivation and experimental drugs in order to explore the origins of human awareness. What begins as controlled investigation quickly escalates. Each session pushes further beyond psychological boundaries, blurring the line between observation and participation. The system surrounding the experiment treats risk as acceptable collateral. Ethical oversight exists, but it is secondary to discovery. The subject is not protected from harm. He's permitted to continue because the results are valuable. Curiosity overrides restraint. The core idea of altered states is that once the human mind becomes an object of study, limits lose authority. Consciousness is treated as a mechanism that can be dismantled and reassembled. Identity becomes unstable. The individual becomes both subject and evidence. As the experiment intensifies, physical regression mirrors psychological collapse. The system does not intervene to stop the process. It records it. What matters is not preservation of the person, but access to data. The film frames experimentation as a self-sustaining cycle. Discovery creates justification for further intrusion. Consent becomes ongoing rather than informed. Once participation begins, withdrawal is no longer simple. Altered state suggests that systems do not always dehumanize through force. Sometimes they do it through curiosity. When understanding becomes the goal, the individual becomes expendable. The experiment continues not because it is safe, but because it reveals something new. In this future, knowledge is not neutral. It carries a cost, and that cost is human stability. 7. Scanners 2. The New Order. Scanners 2. The New Order presents human experimentation as a tool of governance rather than discovery. Individuals with telepathic abilities are no longer anomalies to be studied. They are assets to be identified, controlled, and deployed within a power structure that values obedience over understanding. The film follows a scanner who becomes entangled in a system that recruits, trains, and exploits people with extraordinary mental capabilities. These individuals are separated from society and reshaped into operatives. Their abilities define their worth. Their identities become secondary to their function. What defines this system is its practicality. There is no interest in the personal cost of exploitation. Training replaces consent. Surveillance replaces trust. Control is enforced through dependency and fear rather than ideology. The scanners are interchangeable, managed as resources rather than people. The core idea of the film centers on militarization of the human mind. Telepathy becomes a weapon, and those who possess it are absorbed into hierarchies that strip them of autonomy. Loyalty is not earned. It is engineered. As the system consolidates power, its instability becomes clear. Control depends on absolute compliance. Once resistance emerges, the structure fractures quickly. The scanners who were treated as tools become threats the moment they act independently. Scanners 2. 2 frames human experimentation as an extension of institutional ambition. Power does not fear human potential. It seeks to regulate it. The system does not aim to understand these individuals. It aims to manage them efficiently. The film suggests a future where extraordinary human traits are no longer personal characteristics, but state-controlled resources. In such a system, individuality is tolerated only when it aligns with command. The moment it does not, it is corrected or eliminated. Here, experimentation is not a means to knowledge. It is a method of control. 8. Project Shadow Chaser. Project Shadow Chaser treats human experimentation as an engineering problem. The system does not attempt to persuade, rehabilitate, or reform. It builds a weapon and expects it to function. Human traits are filtered out where possible. Obedience is prioritized over personality. The film centers on a synthetic operative created to serve military objectives. He is designed to follow commands without hesitation and complete missions without moral interference. Memory is regulated. Emotion is suppressed. His existence is defined entirely by assignment. What matters in this system is predictability. Any sign of hesitation or reflection is interpreted as a flaw. When fragments of individuality begin to surface, the response is immediate. The asset must be corrected, contained, or replaced. Self-awareness is treated as a malfunction. The experiment assumes that humanity can be removed without consequence. What the system fails to anticipate is that even limited exposure to choice creates instability. The subject begins to question orders not because he was programmed to rebel, but because reasoning cannot be fully isolated from action. As control weakens, the system reveals its limits. Authority depends on compliance, and compliance depends on suppressing awareness. Once that balance shifts, force becomes the only remaining option. Project Shadow Chaser presents a future where experimentation is indistinguishable from manufacturing. People are no longer tested to understand them. They are constructed to be used. The film suggests that systems built on efficiency often collapse when confronted with even minimal autonomy. In this world, the danger is not machines becoming human. It is systems discovering how little humanity they require to operate. 9. Fortress. Fortress presents human experimentation as a function of automated control. The system does not rely on ideology or persuasion. It relies on regulation. A privately run prison uses implant surveillance and algorithmic enforcement to manage every aspect of inmate behavior. The story is set in a future where population control has normalized extreme punishment. Inmates are monitored continuously. Bodily functions are tracked. Pain is administered mechanically when rules are broken. There is no discretion and no negotiation. The system reacts automatically. What defines this form of experimentation is how behavior becomes data. Every action produces feedback. Every deviation triggers correction. The individual is reduced to a profile governed by thresholds and limits. Survival depends on understanding the system, rather than appealing to authority. Consent disappears immediately upon entry. Once inside, resistance becomes self-harm. The system does not need to intimidate. It enforces compliance through inevitability. Punishment is predictable, consistent, and impersonal. The core idea of Fortress is that control becomes most effective when it removes human judgment entirely. There are no guards to confront, no officials to convince. Authority exists only as code. The film suggests a future where incarceration is no longer about rehabilitation or justice. It is about optimization. Human beings are not corrected. They are regulated. And once regulation replaces oversight, experimentation becomes permanent. 10. Cyborg. In Cyborg, human experimentation emerges from collapse rather than order. Civilization has failed, but systems remain. Information becomes the most valuable resource, and human bodies become the most reliable method of transporting it. The central figure is a cybernetically enhanced woman whose memory contains data critical to rebuilding society. This information strips her of autonomy. Protection becomes possession. Survival becomes conditional. She is treated less as a person and more as infrastructure. The system here is informal but relentless. Whoever controls the data controls the future. Groups compete to capture, exploit, or eliminate the carrier. The experiment is not overseen by institutions, but by necessity. What makes this scenario unsettling is its logic. There is no pretense of ethics. The world has accepted that exploitation is a requirement for progress. Humanity is secondary to utility. The film frames experimentation as an adaptive process. When systems collapse, new ones form around whatever remains valuable. In this case, that value is embedded in the human mind. Cyborg suggests a future where people are no longer experimented on in laboratories, but in transit. Identity dissolves under pressure. The difference between human and system becomes irrelevant when both are treated as interchangeable resources. 11. The Island of Dr. Moreau. The Island of Dr. Moreau depicts human experimentation as absolute authority, unchecked by consequence. The system exists solely because one individual believes he has the right to redesign life according to personal logic. On the island, living beings are reshaped through surgery, conditioning, and imposed rules. Pain is reframed as instruction. Obedience is enforced through ritual. The subjects are taught what they are allowed to be and punished for deviation. What defines this experiment is its hierarchy. The system does not seek improvement or understanding. It seeks control. The law imposed on the subjects exists to maintain order, not to protect them. Identity is dictated rather than developed. The collapse of the system reveals its fragility. Control depends on fear and repetition. Once authority weakens, structure disintegrates rapidly. The experiment cannot sustain itself without constant enforcement. The film suggests that experimentation becomes tyranny when power replaces restraint. Technology is not required. Permission is enough. The Island of Dr. Moreau frames dehumanization as a choice rather than an accident. When systems are built without limits, humanity is not lost through progress, but through deliberate design. 12. The Lawnmower Man 2. The Lawnmower Man 2 presents human experimentation in a fully digital context. Consciousness is no longer tied to the body. The human mind becomes information that can be expanded, connected, and absorbed into a larger network. What began as enhancement turns into infrastructure. The film follows a system that treats intelligence as a scalable resource. Individual minds are linked together to form a centralized digital structure. Identity becomes secondary to processing power. Once connected, separation is no longer encouraged. Independence is reframed as inefficiency. What defines this experiment is its promise. Connectivity is sold as progress. Expansion is framed as evolution. But participation is not equal. Control flows in one direction. Those who manage the network decide how thought is used and where it is allowed to go. Consent fades as integration deepens. Minds are monitored. Behavior is guided. Resistance is labeled corruption. The system does not need physical force. It enforces compliance through dependency. The core idea of the Lawnmower Man 2 is that when consciousness becomes data, humanity becomes optional. The system does not replace people. It incorporates them until individuality no longer functions. The film suggests a future where experimentation no longer alters the human body. It absorbs the human mind. And once absorption is complete, there is nothing left to resist. 13. Cube. Cube presents one of the most impersonal visions of human experimentation in science fiction. There is no visible authority, no clear objective, and no identifiable creator. The system exists simply because it was built. A group of strangers is trapped inside a massive mechanical structure, governed by rules they did not choose and barely understand. Movement triggers consequences. Patterns determine survival. The people inside are not selected for who they are, but for how they respond. What defines the experiment is its absence of intent. No one inside the cube knows who is responsible. Those who contributed to its construction believe they only worked on isolated components. Responsibility is fragmented until it disappears. The system does not adapt or negotiate. It observes. Human behavior becomes the data. Fear, cooperation, betrayal, and logic are all recorded through outcome. The experiment continues regardless of suffering. The core idea of Cube is that systems can outlive purpose. Once established, they operate automatically. Human lives become incidental to their function. The film suggests a future where experimentation persists, not because it is justified, but because no one has the authority to stop it. When accountability vanishes, control becomes permanent. 14. The Cell. The Cell explores human experimentation through direct access to the mind. Technology allows investigators to enter another person's consciousness, turning memory and trauma into navigable spaces. The human psyche becomes a site to be explored and altered. The system justifies this intrusion as necessity. Lives are at risk. Justice requires action. Consent becomes irrelevant when urgency takes priority. The subject's inner world is treated as terrain rather than identity. What defines this experiment is imbalance. One mind is entered. The other retains control. Power is absolute. Vulnerability is total. The system does not ask whether entry should be allowed. It asks whether results can be obtained. As boundaries dissolve, the distinction between observation and manipulation collapses. Exposure becomes influence. Healing becomes intervention. The experiment reshapes what it examines. The film suggests that when technology reaches the mind, privacy no longer exists. Thought becomes accessible. Identity becomes adjustable. The Cell frames experimentation as a final intrusion. When the mind itself becomes a system that can be accessed and modified, autonomy has nowhere left to retreat. 15. Fortress 2. Re-entry. Fortress 2. Re-entry presents the final stage of human experimentation, total enforcement. The system no longer confines people within institutions. It extends control beyond walls, beyond borders, and into constant surveillance. Those targeted by the system are not criminals in the traditional sense. They are anomalies. Individuals who have already demonstrated resistance. Their existence represents a flaw that must be corrected. The system operates through tracking, automation, and reach. Distance offers no protection. Escape is treated as a technical error. Control follows wherever the individual goes. What defines this stage is inevitability. There are no negotiations and no loopholes. Compliance is enforced through persistence rather than punishment. The system does not need prisons. It needs access. The film suggests that once experimentation shifts from containment to pursuit, freedom becomes obsolete. Survival depends on remaining invisible, not independent. Fortress 2 closes the list by showing the logical endpoint of people turned into systems. When control becomes total, experimentation no longer seeks understanding. It seeks permanence. Across all 15 films, the pattern is consistent. Human experimentation rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with justification, efficiency, security, progress. Each system believes it is solving a problem. In doing so, it gradually removes the individual from the equation. These stories show how easily people can be redefined as functions, assets, or variables once a system decides that outcomes matter more than autonomy. Control does not arrive suddenly. It expands step by step until participation feels unavoidable and resistance feels irrational. What makes these films enduring is not their technology, but their logic. The systems they depict do not fail because they are extreme. They fail because they are internally consistent. The question these movies leave behind is simple, but unresolved. Which of these systems feels closest to the world we live in now? And if it were already operating around us, would we recognize it or accept it as normal?